These 7 shadows are the original 7 members of Shadow Garden, not including Sid himself. They consist of Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, Epsilon, Zeta, and Eta. Of course, these names were given to them by Sid since he didn't know their real names and thought these would be cool code names for them. These 7 were the only ones in Shadow Garden to receive personal training from Sid prior to them going off and furthering their influence throughout the world. Because of this, they actually have quite unique fighting styles, since he often catered their training to their strengths and weaknesses. This is quite different from the other members, of whom were all trained by Lambda and therefore fight with a somewhat similar style to each other. Now, before I get to the ranking and explaining of their abilities, I do want to preface that despite the importance of these characters, we actually have very little knowledge of just how powerful these members are. However, despite that, I do believe we have enough to somewhat confidently rank these members, though just know that things could change pretty quickly with any new release. I also want to mention for my anime-only folks that I will be discussing things from the light novels, specifically Volume 5 and 6, since we get quite a bit about Zeta and Eta in those volumes. I won't be discussing too much from the game just because they introduce weapons and abilities that we have yet to see members use in the other iterations of the series, i.e. mostly the scythe that Epsilon uses and the bow that Beta uses. I will say that I do believe that these weapons and abilities could be canon, but because we haven't seen them ever used by any of these members, and games are oftentimes designed with different goals in mind, I'm just not going to talk about it and really consider it for this sake of this video because I think it just gets a little messy. Anyway, now I believe I've covered all my bases, so without further ado, let's get into the ranking, starting with our weakest member of the 7 Shadows, Gamma. I don't believe anyone is surprised by this ranking since she's even stated by Sid to be the weakest member of this group, and when it comes to combat, he is actually an incredibly reliable source. Funny enough, so is Delta, and she is seen referring to Gamma as weak on multiple occasions. In fact, she used to bully her when they were younger because of her weakness. Now, just because Gamma is weak doesn't actually mean that she is weak. Yeah, that sounds incredibly dumb, but what I mean is that she actually has quite insane physical and magical strength. She just lacks the coordination to do pretty much anything with those strengths. In the one fight we see her in, she's able to easily take blows from a fighter who is considered to be a master at his fencing style. Yes, she does say ow and react in a pretty sensitive way, but there were no signs of any considerable damage done to her. So I mostly assume that she reacts this way because she's rarely fighting anybody and therefore not used to taking any form of pain. Except for nosebleeds because, I mean, she's tripping over herself, I think, daily. So I just assume that form of pain she's probably just more accustomed to and therefore unlikely to really acknowledge it. Anyway, we also know that her magical abilities are quite impressive because also in this same fight, when her magically enhanced sword actually lands a blow on her opponent, albeit completely accidentally, he is immediately exploded and taken out in one hit. She also is considered by Sid to be the smartest member of the Shadows. This is the one thing that he says is going for her. And that kind of implies that he's saying that she's even smarter than Eta. We also get to see her intelligence perfectly displayed in this fight with her ability to immediately recognize her opponent's fencing style and properly acknowledge the weaknesses that it has. Now, even with one-shot exploding magic swords, genius-level intelligence, and a body that can attack incredibly quickly and take hits from a well-trained opponent, she is still by far the weakest member of the 7 Shadows. In fact, she could be one of the weakest members in all of Shadow Garden, simply because she can't land a single hit. You see, Gamma is so uncoordinated that no matter how hard she tries, she will never purposefully land a hit on a target, even moving as fast as she can. Not even luck is likely enough for her. In fact, that's the only thing Sid could think of that could help her, as when training her, he basically told her to just pack as much magic into her sword as possible and just start swinging, since he couldn't come up with literally any other way for her to fight. Oh, and let's not forget about the sound effects that he told her to add as well. Now, because of this insanely comedic weakness, she is easily the weakest member of the Seven Shadows, and it's not even really close. Like, to be perfectly honest, the gap between rank 6 and Gamma on this list is possibly greater than the gap between 6 and rank 1 on this list. So that's just how much weaker Gamma really is. Like, honestly, Rose, before training with Lambda, was possibly stronger than Gamma. And, I mean, hell, even her before being cured was likely stronger than Gamma. Anyway, enough roasting poor Gamma, let's move on to the next member, which is going to be Ada. Now, I thought incredibly long and hard about where to put Ada, since we finally get to see her fight in Volume 6, and she's actually quite powerful, despite a lot of people speculating that she wouldn't be that strong, and likely would only be a bit stronger than Gamma, since she is always doing nerdy science stuff and sleeping all day. However, those people were wrong. Very wrong. And I was those people. Now, some people who know about the fight I'm referring to might be wondering why she's even this low on the ranking, and the reason for that is actually a few things. But before I talk about that, let's first discuss what she's actually capable of. So, what we see her do in her fight against Beta and later some other Shadow Garden members, though that part of the fight is very brief and not many blows are actually traded. However, we do see a lot with her and Beta fighting, and what we get to see Ada use is mostly a shield that is capable of absorbing magic, and her ability to change slime into any form with ease, as well as control each shape independently and simultaneously, displaying an incredible ability to manage multiple strategies and thoughts all at once. So, unlike Gamma, Ada is easily able to put her incredible intellect to use in combat, and it's likely the main reason that she's as strong as she is, since we don't see her really display any meaningful feats of physical strength and likely relies more on her magic and intelligence. We also get to see her use an ability that disrupts all magic except for hers in a certain area, though she does say that this can be a bit weird since certain conditions need to be met. What those exactly are, we don't really know, but that's what she says. Now, that all is actually quite impressive, and in her fight against Beta and even some other members of Shadow Garden like Epsilon, Lambda, Omega, Nu, and several others, she seems to have come out victorious in her fight against them, which would imply that she's actually stronger than them, right? However, she refers to her magic-absorbing shield and her magic-disrupting field as technology, not abilities, which kind of implies that these aren't actual strengths of hers, or rather things that she could potentially easily use or replicate. Not to mention that the disruption field was the only thing that really bothered any of the members, and Ada mentioned that she likely wouldn't be able to use it all the time. Also, when Alpha shows up to confront her later, Ada's plans are easily foiled by tinfoil. Yes, pun intended, I'm sorry. But considering that the disruptive field can be blocked by something as simple as tinfoil and therefore only really useful in surprise situations, I highly doubt Beta or Epsilon or really any member of Shadow Garden will fall for that trick again. Anyway, because the fight between her and Beta was somewhat even before she brought out the disruption field, but after she displayed her shield, I would argue that Ada likely is still weaker than Beta on average, and only saw a huge boost to strength with these surprising inventions of hers. Now, with that being said, I did at one point put Ada above both Beta and Epsilon because of this fight, and I could completely get behind the idea that she is stronger. Regardless, I would say that they are incredibly close in strength under normal circumstances, and their ranking could be basically interchangeable since they are so close in strength. Now, enough yapping about that. Let's move on to our next character and my personal favorite Seven Shadow member, Epsilon. Yes, I am putting Epsilon higher than Ada, I'll explain that too, but first I want to explain what she's capable of first. Now, Epsilon is praised by Sid as being the best at magic control, which means that she is able to so precisely control any amount of magic so as to not waste any of it. See, normally when magic is put into an attack or used in everyday scenarios, there is usually some excess that gets wasted. This is completely normal for pretty much everybody, except Sid and those trained by him. This is one of the reasons why Sid is so much stronger than a lot of people. With good magic control, you not only can make sure not to waste magic, but also freely shape it into anything you want and condense it so much that it can become exponentially stronger. Epsilon is so good at doing all of these things that she's even given a nickname of Epsilon the Precise. Though she also has a nickname of Epsilon the Faithful too. I don't know, she gets a lot of titles. Anyway, ironically, her magic control is not only her biggest strength, but also her biggest weakness, because she chooses to use her magical abilities not only to become stronger, but also to make herself as beautiful as possible. She uses slime to coat her body and shape it into what she considers to be the perfect body. She does this because she thinks that this will lure Sid into falling in love with her. However, because she is so terrified of being exposed, she will almost never put herself into a situation where magic is not available. This is why she instantly flees from Ada once the magic disruption field gets activated. She is out of there. Insanely quick. Nobody even saw her dip. She just vanished instantly. Anyway, magic isn't the only thing she's capable of using in combat, though. She's actually an insanely talented swordswoman as well. In fact, pretty much every 7 Shadow member from this point on is insane at close quarters combat, though Ada and Epsilon are known mostly for their ranged abilities, since they have some of the best magic control that's seen in the entire organization. Now, as for how good Epsilon is at sword fighting, we actually can use a statement made by Sid when fighting Beatrix. You see, while fighting Beatrix, Sid actually praises her for having an incredible talent with the sword, saying that her abilities are almost as good as ours. Which is a bit of an odd way to put it, since it seems like he's referring to Shadow Garden as a whole. And since Beatrix is seen as being able to somewhat hold her own against him, that must mean that she's incredibly talented, and therefore Shadow Garden is incredibly talented. However, while it can be easy to assume he's referring to all of Shadow Garden, it's much more likely that he's only referring to the 7 Shadows, since those are the only members he actually remembers and interacts with. Not to mention that he personally trained them and would likely only know their abilities and not the other members that were trained by Lambda. Now, we can pretty confidently say that he likely is not talking about Gamma when he made this statement. And considering we see literally no notable feats of actual sword fighting from Ada, it's also probably safe to assume he's not referring to her either. And also, since Delta is rarely seen using a sword and mostly using claws, it's possible that he isn't necessarily referring to her either. But she does bonk people with a big-ass sword, so maybe. Now, if he isn't talking about the nameless Shadow Garden members he doesn't know about, and isn't talking about Gamma, Ada, and possibly Delta, well then that doesn't really leave many others, but because we do see Alpha, Beta, Epsilon, and Zeta all use swords at incredibly high levels, I think it is safe to assume that he might be referring to them when he says ours. Now, I know I just spent probably too much time clarifying that. I do think it's important though, since it has to do with more than half of the people we're talking about, and it does help us better understand their abilities and power scale them. So, to summarize Epsilon's abilities, she not only is the best magic control user in not only Shadow Garden, but likely one of the best in the entire series, she also likely is on par with, or at least relative to, Beatrix in terms of swordplay, and has slime boobs. Oh, and I also forgot to mention that because of her magic control, she is one of only 3 characters to be confirmed to be capable of curing possession, the other 2 obviously being Sid and Alpha. So yeah, even though Epsilon is still only rank 5 on this list, her abilities and kit are incredibly impressive and only really held back by her fear of having her fake slime boobies exposed. And not in that way, you degenerate.
Stop it. Get some help.
Anyway, let's move on to the next one, which is Epsilon's rival in love and in combative strength, Beta. Like I mentioned with Eta and Beta earlier being almost interchangeable in terms of ranking on this list, Epsilon and Beta are also honestly interchangeable. In fact, all three of them could really be ranked in any of these three spots, and I could probably get behind it. That being said, I chose Beta to be the highest ranked because she is the most well-rounded out of the three and is seen going on the most missions, of which all of them are incredibly different and require tons of different talents to pull off. Now, unfortunately, because Beta is so commonly seen throughout the series, she also is seen not only having some incredible feats, but also some negative ones as well. She's also not always given the best times to shine, since oftentimes Sid shows up and trumps pretty much anything that anybody was doing. Regardless of those facts though, I think there is a reason she has chosen to be on as many missions as she is, and she also is seen being incredibly talented and versatile. I mean, she's intelligent enough to learn Japanese within like a week or something. Like, it's crazy. She's also mentioned by Akane Nishimura to be incredibly talented and that other members of Shadow Garden pale in comparison to her. The best way that I can explain Beta, honestly, is that she's just a copy of Alpha, but lacked some of the incredible talent that Alpha has, and instead worked incredibly hard to get as strong as she is. She also doesn't really have any crazy weaknesses like Epsilon has, and therefore is willing to fight in more scenarios. Her magic is seen as being not as great as maybe Eta or Epsilon's, but is still better than most of the strongest Dark Knights in any country. She also is likely to have as much, if not more, talent with a sword as Beatrix, considering the previously mentioned statement by Sid, and likely is better at swordplay than Epsilon since she's mostly seen favoring melee combat over other forms. Now, that's pretty much it when it comes to Beta. She's a really well-rounded fighter and capable of a lot of different things, and is able to do many of those things at an incredibly high level. Anyway, on to our next one, which is the incredibly peculiar Zeta. Zeta is mentioned to be as talented as Alpha, if not even more so. However, she lacks the interest and attention span to properly master pretty much anything. She is a therianthrope, so she's very physically strong, and unlike Delta, who is seen as being incredibly dumb, Zeta is seen as being incredibly smart. She was able to teach herself to read at a very young age, and found an interest in various topics that she would read about daily. As I mentioned before, she's said to be as talented as Alpha, being more than capable of learning pretty much anything very quickly. But because things oftentimes come to her quickly, she almost just as quickly drops them. We see this with her ability to have learned the vampire mist form technique, just like Alpha, but unlike Alpha, was unable to perfect it, and because of that, was nearly defeated by Delta. She's also stated to be able to use a multitude of weapons, and is insanely effective with magic, also having an equally high diversity of abilities when it comes to that as well. If Beta is like Alpha that lacked some talent, then Zeta is like Alpha that lacked the determination of hard work. Because of that, she never really reaches the heights of what she could be capable of, with one single exception: her ability to mask her presence. Zeta is so talented at masking her presence that she's basically invisible to most people. I mean, even Sid has trouble finding her at times. And it's because of her ability to hide that she is able to give Delta so much trouble whenever they fight. Speaking of Delta, that is our next character on the list, and what I consider to be the second strongest member of the Seven Shadows, as well as all of Shadow Garden, with the exception of Sid, obviously. Now, Delta is pretty simple when it comes to her abilities. She's likely the strongest character in the entire series in terms of raw physical strength, at least from what we've seen so far. The only character who is likely stronger being Sid, and that's likely only after he applies magic to himself. Delta is probably stronger physically when magic is not applied. That being said, she is still incredibly good at magic, though not nearly to the same degree as most other members. Delta lacks a lot of the finesse with her magic, and isn't even close to having the same level of magical control as somebody like Epsilon. However, she has a ton of magic and is considered by Sid to be the best at condensing magic. This is how she was easily able to still use magic within the sanctuary and even form an incredibly large sword to bonk the creepy priest dude with. Now, as for why I put Delta over Zeta, even though their fights never end with a clear victor, is because I do genuinely think Delta is stronger. It's just that Zeta is slippery. I think Sid himself even states that if any of Delta's attacks were to land on Zeta, they would likely decimate her and immediately end the fight. Whereas we see Zeta land quite a few blows on Delta, and she seems completely fine to keep fighting, even when those attacks are insanely powerful. Delta is just too tanky and hyped up on cat hatred to let it bother her. It also should be mentioned that their fights only really end with either Alpha getting involved and stopping it, or Zeta fleeing, which could be because Zeta loses interest in things really easily, or possibly because she knows she can't win. Though I believe it's most likely because she sees no way to easily beat Delta, and therefore leaves since it's too much of a bother to continue. So honestly, kind of like a combination of the two things. I will say, though, that Delta and Zeta are incredibly close in terms of strength, and that's likely why Delta constantly attacks on sight, because she feels the need to prove herself to be the stronger one. See, Delta comes from a tribe that praised strength above anything else. It's why she bullied Gamma when they were younger, and why she praises her boss man and fears Alpha so much. It's because they are stronger than her. But with Zeta, she likely feels a bit threatened, since they are so relative in terms of strength, and she feels the need to prove that she's the stronger of the two. Of course, it could also just be because she hates cats too, but I'm kind of hoping it's at least something deeper than that. Anyway, without further ado, we finally get to our strongest member of not only the Seven Shadows, but also of Shadow Garden, being second to only Shadow himself. We have the true leader of Shadow Garden, Alpha. Now, I think it's really easy to forget just how powerful Alpha is. As I mentioned with previous members, she is likely on par with Beatrix in terms of swordsmanship, though likely stronger and much closer to Sid himself. It's also stated that a fully awoken vampire queen, Elizabeth, has about as much magic as Alpha, which is stated by Beta, and it almost seems like she's surprised Elizabeth could have that much, which implies that Alpha has an insanely high mana pool. I mean, Elizabeth is likely one of the strongest characters we've ever seen in the series, at least at this point. So for Alpha to have as much magic as her, and for that to be surprising, not because Alpha is on par with one of the strongest characters in history, mind you, but rather because one of the strongest characters in history is as strong as Alpha, is fucking insane. Like, Alpha is the perfect student to Sid. She spent the most time with him and absorbed pretty much everything he ever taught her. It's because of her absorbing anything and everything from him that she's as strong as she is. And it's also how she was able to come up with the idea to use tinfoil against Ada, which is hilarious, but I digress. Alpha has perfected every ability she has ever developed, and has even shown to be capable of learning and mastering completely new abilities within an insanely short period of time, like with Mist Form when she perfected that skill in only like a month or something. Not to mention that she is the only character in the entire series so far to actually land a legitimate blow against Sid. I will say he was nerfing himself a little by only using magic strings, but still, she was still able to land a legitimate attack on him, something I don't think anybody else has been able to do. Like, usually he allows hits to go through, but with Alpha, she did catch him off guard. She's also able to cure possession and use her own version of I Am Atomic, where she doesn't become atomic herself, but rather coats her blade in a somewhat similar type of magic that can disintegrate things. She's honestly so insanely powerful that I wouldn't be surprised if we do eventually see her use a version of Sid's atomic abilities. It's also probably important to mention that Rose was so terrified of Alpha's strength that she mentioned Alpha could likely take on an entire nation by herself and possibly come out victorious. And if she didn't, it would still be devastating for that nation. Rose also mentions that if the Seven Shadows worked together, they would likely easily destroy a nation with just the 7 of them, which goes to show you just how powerful these characters are, even though we likely haven't gotten to see everything that they're capable of. Anyway, that'll do it for this one. I know this was much longer than some of my other videos, but hopefully you enjoyed regardless. Let me know if you agree with my ranking, or if you don't, let me know what you would change. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Peace.